network, and I'm really flattered and honored to be invited to speak to you today, albeit through the miracle of the internet rather than in person. So the talk I'm going to give today is part of a new book project that I'm working on, which is tentatively entitled A Theory of Political Truth. And it is what it sounds like. I over the last 20 years, for the first decade of this century, I worked on the nature of truth. And then for the last decade, as we were just hearing, I've been spending that time thinking about democracy and its relation to knowledge and knowledge production. And what I found is that I really both felt creatively, but also just in terms of what I thought was important, that we needed a theory of what political truth was. And in fact, if there is such a thing. And so in working on that topic, one of the things that I've come to realize that I've been ignoring throughout much of my recent work, and I think a lot of people, with some exceptions, some of whom are I believe here today, a lot of people have not also been paying attention to, and that's the question of the nature of political judgments. And so with that introduction, I'll just get started on this presentation. So this talk begins, like so many other philosophical talks, with a puzzle. And the puzzle that I want to talk about could be introduced by the remark, a famous remark of the novelist, German novelist Thomas Mann, who is often credited with remarking that there is nothing that is not political. He said, everything is politics. And in today's culture, world global culture, where mask wearing, the climate, the weather, for God's sakes, are all politicized. All these matters that seem to be completely non-political or apolitical, scientific matters, are politicized. It's easy to sympathize with Mann's remark. And while we might think that his remark is a little bit exaggerated, he's a novelist after all, not a philosopher, and it brings with it some poetic license. It does bring to mind something that seems more plausible, which I'll call Mann's maxim, that almost anything can become political. It may not be that everything is politics, but it certainly seems plausible to think that almost anything can become political or politicized. And if you think about that, and you think about how global politics have unfolded in the last decade, really, or 2 decades, that raises a question. If everything or almost anything can become political, what really distinguishes political judgments from other sorts of judgments? We think there is a distinction, but what would the difference be? What makes a political judgment political? That's the question I'm interested in today. And this is a practical, real-life problem, but it's also a theoretical one. And it's one that I thought would be good for this network, because this is applied philosophy writ large. Because after all, if we want to understand theoretically how or even if there can become political knowledge, then we need to understand how political judgments can be true and false, if they can be true or false. And to understand that, we need to know what kind of judgment a political judgment really is. So if we're interested in political epistemology, we really need to be interested in this question. Now, an initial answer to this question, my initial answer, was motivated by the following line of thought. Well, when we're interested in distinguishing, let's say, mathematical judgments from other sorts of judgments, or moral judgments from other sorts of judgments, what do? We look at the content of those judgments, that is, the propositions they express. And here you might think that an initial answer to this question would be motivated by that methodological consideration. Moreover, you might think, well, the first thing to do if you want to know what a political judgment is to know what politics is. And well, we might say that politics is concerned with how best to arrange our collective life in the face of problems of conflict that is disagreements over who gets the resources, and problems of coordination, that is disagreements about how we can best use those resources together. That's a pretty well-known way of understanding what politics is, and it seems reasonable enough. After all, those sorts of arrangements, answers to the questions of how best to arrange our collective life and face these problems of conflict and coordination, give rise to political society and authority, and thus much of politics concerns both the use of such authority as a way of resolving our collective problems and efforts, of course, to justify that use to each other. So perhaps this initial answer goes, so perhaps political judgments are those with a particular kind of propositional content. What kind of propositional content? Well, political judgments are those that are about, that is, their content concerns what we collectively ought to do in the face of conflict and coordination problems. Now, I think loosely speaking, this characterization of political judgment is plausible because it describes what political disagreements are ultimately about. I'll talk more about this later. So I think insofar as it describes what politics is about and what political disagreements are about, I think loosely speaking, this is okay. But it's far too narrow to use as a definition of political judgments generally. Because what it says is that all political judgments have propositional content of a certain form. Presumably, that's what we would understand it, strictly speaking. And strictly speaking, therefore, it would exclude all these sorts of judgments. Give you a chance to look at them. Healthcare is a right, not a privilege. Mass mandates are infringement on personal liberty. Climate change should be combated because not doing so is unjust to future generations. These are all paradigmatic political judgments, the sorts of things that real politics and real political scientists are concerned to discuss. But none of them have that explicit form. None of them have propositional content with the form X is what we ought to collectively do. So our initial answer, while promising in certain ways, doesn't seem really to hit the target. So we might think, well, let's modify that answer and do what we would do when we're thinking about distinguishing mathematics from moral judgments. We look to the concepts that constitutes the propositional content of such judgments. So in the case of mathematics, we look to say, well, mathematical judgments are those that concern concepts that involve concepts, their propositional content involve concepts like number and immorality, concepts like moral obligation, etc. So maybe what we should say is political judgments have content that is explicitly involving overtly political values, values like justice, equality, liberty, and the like. But I think even that definition is not right. It doesn't accord with our actual practice of politics and political speech, nor does it fit with the practice of our science, or discipline at least, for studying politics, political science, or political theory. In order to illustrate that, let me explain. I'll make two broad points. First, as I might put it, answer 2 is much too academic in the not so good sense of that term. It ignores the fact that much political discussion is over policy and not principle. Obviously, a lot of politics is about principles, but a lot of it, as it were, meat and potatoes of politics is political disagreement is over policy. It would be a bizarre theory of political judgments which did not account for political judgments like, like carbon emissions need to be decreased in order to effectively combat climate change. That seems like to me, and I hope to most of us, a obviously true political judgment, but it is a judgment that is, I say, political, or can be political, as I'll go on to say, in certain contexts, and is certainly the subject of political disagreement and political policy making. Here's another judgment, one that I consider to be false, but which again fits the description of a policy, and a policy that is indeed debated, for example, in my country, decreasing about tax policy. Questions about tax policy seem to be the very sorts of things that are that politicians, voters, and practicing political scientists are absolutely obsessed with. Broadly speaking, the difference between judgments of principle and judgments of policy in politics concerns the sorts of reasons we appeal to in order to justify those judgments. So in the case of judgments of principle, those reasons will, as our previous answer suggested, will invoke basic political values. So if somebody says no one should be denied a job solely because of their race or gender, then if asked to defend that, presumably you will refer to concepts like equality, political equality. But when it comes to judgments of policy, the reasons we cite, while perhaps having normative elements, will also appeal in general to empirical facts or things that we consider empirical facts. So when asked to defend the idea that carbon emissions need to be decreased, in most cases, you're going to appeal to, let's say, scientific data. And that's why answer 2 flies in the face of Mann's maxim. It implies that all political judgments are normative judgments. The appeals to fact, and in particular, are often seen as political. And that's an important, I'd say, important feature of political discourse that is often overlooked. So here are some propositions that, stated in the right context, are rightly treated as political. I didn't say the propositions are political. Note, what I said is when stated or judged in the right context can be treated as political. My interest is in political judgments, as you'll see, not in, per se, just the content of those judgments. But let's take the content for the moment. Could take an example like climate change is not real. Various conservatives around, not just in my country, but various places around the globe will make this claim. It is a political claim. It is a political judgment in many, many contexts. And it's hard to imagine, in fact, the context in which it wouldn't be a political judgment, even though it's an attempt to claim something false, but something about the empirical world. Or take another false judgment. The American Civil War was fought for economic reasons and not because of slavery. This is a judgment that was passed off as a purely historical judgment until W.E.B. Du Bois in the early part of the last part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, pointed out that many American white historians were making this claim out of motivations of political ideology, and judged it appropriately. I think Du Bois judged it appropriately as a political judgment. We can imagine economic claims, and in fact, it's not hard. It's economic claims are frequently seen as political judgments, and rightly so. In legal judgments, so take the example in the United States in the U.S., a woman's right to get an abortion is constitutionally protected. Now, according to many people in the United States, that's a true judgment. But some conservative lawyers would argue that that's a judgment based on bad law. And as a result, it's actually, despite the fact that as of right now, at least the US Supreme Court would agree with it, it's actually not true, explicitly what they would say. And that political disagreement over this, which I think the people on both sides of the aisle would agree is a political disagreement, at least in part, indicates, at least plausibly, that this proposition can function politically in certain contexts. And then finally, take the mathematical proposition, 2 + 2 = 4. I put this on here to illustrate really how almost anything, Mann's maxim, almost anything can become political. How, you might ask, could 2 + 2 = 4 be political? Well, those of you who've read George Orwell's 1984 will know what I'm talking about. In the end of that novel, the brutal antagonist, O'Brien, is torturing the hapless Winston, trying to get Winston to state that 2 + 2 = 5. And in fact, he says, trying to get Winston to actually judge or believe that. And for a while, at least, Winston holds out and refuses and says that 2 + 2 = 4. Now, both of the people involved in that conversation know. O'Brien, in fact, explicitly says that Winston is making a political act. By judging that 2 + 2 = 4, he's resisting O'Brien's political authority and therefore engaging in a political act. And O'Brien's very point is the one that I'm making right now, is that almost any proposition in the right context can be the object of a political judgment. And that's important if we're going to theorize about these things. I think what this suggests is we need a better model of political judgments, one which privileges function more over content, doesn't ignore content, but privileges function over content. Earlier, we started by trying to follow the script that we might have used in distinguishing mathematical judgments from moral judgments. But I think we should start from a different place. The guiding thought of what I'm going to suggest today is that what makes a judgment political is the way it functions in our political life. What makes a judgment political is the way it functions in our political life. And I'm going to argue that politics is about what we should collectively do in the face of disagreements over conflicts and problems of coordination. That's what I already have suggested. I think that was our initial answer, was motivated from this observation. And as I said then, and I'm repeating now, I think that's a reasonable description of what politics itself is about. But that in turn, I think, suggests that where there's no political disagreement, there really is no politics. Before that bit with the apple, so to speak, in Eden, in the Garden of Eden, there was no politics because there was no disagreement. Once that event with the apple occurred, politics intruded, and Eden was ended. What that suggests to me is that we could try this model, that a judgment is political if it contributes to a political disagreement. Judgment is political if it contributes to a political disagreement. But then, of course, we now need to answer, we know what we need to do. We need to say what indicates that a judgment is a contribution to a political disagreement. We know what political disagreements are, I've said. They're disagreements over conflicts and coordination, what to do with resources, how to share them, and who gets the resources. So, and we could say, in addition to that, that political disagreements involve disputes because of that over political values. So we could say what a political disagreement is, but what makes a judgment or contribution to such a disagreement? In order to do that, I think it's best to rather than trying to give a high church analytic conceptual analysis, I think it's best to simply lay out certain what I'll call marks of the political. These are those indications that you have a judgment that is functioning as a political judgment because it's contributing to a political disagreement. So the first mark that indicates that a judgment is contributing to a political disagreement is that the truth of the judgment would make an epistemic difference to one or more political disagreements, that the truth of it would make an epistemic difference to one or more political disagreements. So here's an example. The claim mask wearing lowers infection rates. That's a straight, empirical proposition. It's a causal inference based on statistical modeling. That claim, mask wearing lowers infection rates, serves as a defeater, possibly, for some opinions, such as mask wearing doesn't correlate with any change in the rate of infection, and as a reason for other relevant judgments, that somebody might make. We should adopt a national mask wearing mandate. Now, whether or not these judgments are true or false is not important here. What I'm trying to show is that this judgment obviously is situated in a network of reasons, and hence it makes an epistemic difference in a political debate, an existing political debate about whether we should mandate masks, for example, in the United States. The second mark that I think is important to focus on is that political judgments are political. That is, they contribute to political disagreements when they're evaluative. Political judgments are evaluative in the sense that they convey pro or con attitudes towards some propositional content. We're not neutral, right, about our political judgments, to put it mildly. But here's the thing. In politics, and this is incredibly, I think, very important, and it's something I think bears more discussion than I give it here. These evaluations need not be directed at the content of the judgment. Judgments can be used to express attitudes towards other judgments. So, and for example, this election was free of fraud can be used to express a con attitude towards a very different proposition. That is, that the election was rigged, and vice versa, using examples from current politics in the United States. The importance of this can't be understated, because what really, this is a key feature of political discourse. Politicians frequently express negative or positive attitudes towards certain propositions, not by engaging with them directly, but by expressing con or pro attitudes towards judgments that they see as epistemically or politically related to those former judgments. That's indeed, being able to do that skillfully is in fact a key skill of a successful politician or demagogue. Mark 3 is that a judgment that contributes to a political disagreement is one that is generally politically action guiding. Political actions guide us to engage in collective actions, or actions directed at collective ends: donating, organizing, voting, petitioning, protesting. But that's not just true, again, of normative political judgments. A political judgment like climate change is real can, in the right context, motivate a group to alter its own behavior, obviously, to encourage others to do so, to support policies that address the problem, and to respond incredulously to those who deny it. So, very importantly, many of our most action-guiding political judgments are not just normative ones, but non-normative political judgments. Those non-normative political judgments, of course, might be associated with all sorts of normative ones, but some of that action-guiding force, as again, any good politician will tell you, will come primarily from the non-normative. If you think about how political ads and political organizing is done, it's not just always done by pointing to normative claims. If you think about what's written on posters and signs in a political rally, often the sorts of things that are written on those signs are not just normative judgments. In fact, often they're allegations of fraud, for example, to use a recent case, or claims like climate change is real, deal with it. An example of a sign that I saw at a political rally several years ago. The fourth mark is that judgments that function politically are expressive. They express or otherwise implicate our convictions or identity reflecting values. Now, this is, as I've just been indicating, not all that they do, but it's an important aspect of what they do. Now, as I understand it, a conviction is a commitment and that too is a technical term, I can explain that later, a commitment that reflects my self-identity. That is my aspirational self. So my political convictions are those commitments to certain types of actions, for example, that reflect the kind of person I want to be, even if I don't live up to that. The political convictions reflect the kind of person the kind of tribe that I want to be associated with, the kind of groups that I want to belong to. And of course, the kinds of principles that I want to associate with the person that I imagine myself as being. Because they express or implicate our political convictions understood in this way, that is, as identity reflecting values, political judgments notoriously have significant moral and epistemic authority over our lives. Besides being politically action guiding, the way I just described, they can be epistemically action guiding. They can motivate us to ignore counter evidence in order to protect our self-identity. Political judgments, when they reflect our convictions, can motivate us to ignore evidence that we should be engaging with. Why? Because the judgment, if it's reflective of a conviction, is reflective of my self-identity. And so it's practically rational to be epistemically irrational about my political judgments. Because when somebody attacks my political judgments, they, depending on the judgment, can be attacking my conviction. And when you attack my conviction, you're attacking who I imagine myself to be, my identity. And so attacks on our judgments, political judgments, can feel personal because in many cases they are personal. And so we push off information that conflicts with them because we want to protect naturally our own sense of self. That's not always a rational thing to do from the epistemic standpoint, but it can be rational, understood from the position of self-interest. It's a sad fact about the human condition. So here's the summary of the model. What I've just said is that a judgment is political if it contributes to a political disagreement. And I've said that in general, judgments contribute to political disagreements when they make an epistemic difference to that disagreement, when they're evaluative, when they're politically action guiding, and when they're expressive. Now, note that I have not said that it's required that according to the model, that every political judgment has to meet every mark, even if the paradigmatic cases do. That's a point I'll return to in a minute. So I'm not claiming that you have to meet every mark to be a political judgment, but I am claiming that these are the things that we look for when we look to see whether something is contributing, it can be reasonably regarded as contributing to a political disagreement. Now, before I go on, I just want to briefly note that some of you might be thinking, well, wait a second, isn't this model circular? Well, no, I don't think so, not in any problematic way. You might think it might have this problem because the model does suggest that if a judgment is the subject of political disagreement, that it's a political judgment. It doesn't just say that, it says that. It doesn't just suggest that, it states it. So you might say, well, wait a second, aren't we explaining political judgments by appealing to political disagreements? And how can we understand political disagreements without already understanding political judgments? Well, I've just explained how earlier in the talk. In fact, I began, partly for that reason, with a widely known and recognized way of understanding what politics is about. And I used that to explain what political disagreements are about. Political disagreements are disagreements over what we ought to collectively do in the face of issues of conflicts and coordination. And, as I later said, disagreements over political values. That's what political disagreements are, more or less, in every case. And we can use that to understand what a political judgment is without any harmful circularity that I can see. So I now want to turn to the explanatory advantages in the last 10 minutes or so, the explanatory advantages of this model. So unlike our initial answers, the model picks out features of both the content and the act of making a political judgment. It's not just about content, it's about content and the act. And as a result, it allows for both normative and non-normative political judgments, a point that I've been insisting is really important given the actual practice of politics by actual human beings and by what in fact political scientists take themselves to be studying. It explains what unifies normative and non-normative political judgments as well. What unifies them? Well, what unifies them is that they all are functioning a certain way in our political life by contributing to political disagreements. But it also allows us to account for their differences. For example, normative political judgments, especially, are those that concern fundamental political values. And they're often used to characterize our disagreements. What are we disagreeing about? Well, we're disagreeing about equality, and we use an explicit judgment that concerns equality to state that fact. But non-normative judgments are generally used to prosecute those disagreements. It's as I said earlier, the bread and butter of political disagreement as they actually occur. Moreover, the model satisfies Mond's maxim. It allows that almost any proposition can become the content of a political judgment, in the sense that some historical, mathematical, scientific proposition at T1 can become the content of a political judgment at T2, and then later cease to be the content of any political judgment at time T3. Notice how that's stated. So you can have a certain proposition that is a kind of proposition because it has certain kinds of concepts that can become the content of a particular kind of judgment. Now, there's nothing to rule out that one and the same judgment can be both political and something else at the same time. There's nothing in the account that rules that out. But more neutrally, without having to worry about that accounting, we can just simply say that one and the same, a certain proposition can sort of go along in semantic space. It can become the content of a political judgment at a certain time when it contributes to a political disagreement. And then later, when that disagreement disappears and no one disagrees about those things, we might say it ceased to become the content of any political judgment. Nobody's thinking about it as politically. It ceased to become a political matter. So it allows that political judgments can be more or less political and explains how that could be so. That's another feature of the model. How is that? Well, as I said, the marks of the political, I gave 4 of them. There's no doubt more than that. But what I've said is that paradigmatic cases might have all those marks, but they don't have to. Not all political judgments will. What that allows us to say is what's, I think, common practice to say is that judgments can be more or less political. Why? Because they can have more or less of the marks of the political. Even more advantages. Wait, there's more. It accounts for a familiar political fact, this model. What fact? That a judgment can be political even if the judger doesn't intend it to be so. Why? Because whether your judgment contributes to a political disagreement isn't up to you on this model, but to the role it plays in context, whether it hits the marks. And this, after all, is how a novice can inadvertently enter a political disagreement. Many of us have been there. We say something, not intending it to be a part of the political disagreement. Maybe we're trying to diffuse, there's a political argument between 2 friends of ours, and we're in the bar, and they're arguing about politics. And we try to say something that, we think is neutral, that is off topic even. And lo and behold, it turns out, unbeknownst to us, we've actually stepped our foot right into it. And now we've said something that is regarded by both sides as political. I think what that case shows, and I'll give you a more complicated and realistic case in a minute, well, maybe not more realistic, but another case. What this shows is, I think, a sort of consequence, but a good, happy consequence of the model is the model doesn't appeal to the intentions of the judges or the thinkers. It appeals to actually how that judgment is functioning in the context in which it is stated. So I think it also makes sense of another familiar political act, that whether a judgment is political can itself become a political matter. And it often does, actually, especially on the internet. An example, okay, of both. I want to give you an example of these last two. So these last two things, these last two advantages are a little bit more, I think, not as obvious. And so I wanted to give you an example. So imagine we have Elizabeth, who is a climate scientist, testifying on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and is asked to state whether climate change is real. In response, she says, it is real, and it is being made worse by human behavior. Then she adds a second proposition, a second judgment. She makes a second judgment, and saying this, she says, I am speaking as a scientist. This is Elizabeth speaking. That's not a political claim. What's not a political claim? Her first judgment. She's saying it is real, climate change is real, and in saying this, I'm not speaking as a scientist. The first claim was not political. I'm only stating the facts as the evidence I've reviewed indicates them to be. Let us stipulate that her second claim is an honest statement of her intentions. That's not hard. But we can still imagine that some of the Republican or conservative senators listening, and many of the political commentators commenting, might nonetheless classify both of her remarks, number one and number two, as political judgments. Who is right? Is Elizabeth right? Or are they right? Well, an advantage of the model is I think it allows us to explain the complexities of this actual case. It is an actual case. I've just changed the names. Elizabeth is right that claim one isn't a normative political judgment. She's right about that. It's not a statement of political values. So that's number one. There's number one again. But the commentators are right that claim two is nonetheless political in that it contributes to a political disagreement. Because it is part of the political disagreement over climate change. Part of the political disagreement that's happening in the United States and in Brazil and certain other countries is whether the science, the claims of scientists are themselves political and politically motivated. That's part of the disagreement. Those who disagree, who think that climate change is unreal, climate deniers, part and parcel of their theory is that scientists are involved in some conspiracy to convince us of certain alleged facts for political ends. That's part of the political disagreement. So we might say the commentators are right to claim that claim two is, although Elizabeth might not like it, is in fact itself a political. Sorry. But what about her claim that climate change being real was not political? Her claim that the second judgment itself political. Oh, I see that there's a okay. Hopefully this will become clear. Maybe we'll have to talk about it in discussion. There's a typo there. So what I'm asking now is, she says that the first. So there's three things that I'm asking about. One is the question. I'm pointing at the screen as if I'm pointing at a whiteboard. Sorry, I don't know why I'm doing that. Get very excited. So the one is whether proposition one there, or judgment one in red, is political. Well, it's not normatively political. Then the second question is proposition 1 or 2, judgment 1 or 2, are they political? Well, they could be, as I just explained. Now, in proposition 2, she makes a claim about proposition 1. She says that 1 is not political. Is that true? Well, it could be. It could be true or it could be false. It could be a matter of debate itself or contribute to a political debate in just the way I was describing. Imagine the conservatives denounce her second judgment as trying to disguise her politics. So she says, look, when I'm claiming that climate change is real, I'm not making a political claim. I'm stating the facts, people. I sympathize with her. Her political opponents will say, well, no, actually, you're not stating the facts. You're just making a political judgment. Well, it's really not up to them to determine what is a political judgment. It's not up to any of us. It's up to the features of the context, the content, and facts about the judging situation. It's whether that judgment hits certain marks. So I think what we can say is that while this Elizabeth's testimony is not normatively political, and that's super important, and that's what she's trying to get across, we can see that it contributes to a political disagreement. And indeed, the claim that it's not political contributes to a political disagreement. And that's a strength of the model. It allows us to understand the layers of complexity. It allows us to say that the judgment that J is a political judgment can itself become a political judgment. Politics can iterate for as long as our vocal cords and our patience can tolerate. Okay, so I'm at the end. So the realm of the political is different from that of the moral or the aesthetic or the physical. That seems obvious. The borders of the political, however, are not determined by a kind of propositional content. Political judgments of any kind play a distinctive role in our lives. In making them, we undertake rational commitments. We motivate, we persuade, and perhaps most importantly, we express our identities. And this shows us, I think, that our political epistemology must be nuanced and multidimensional. What I've just said, I think, really complicates political epistemology. Moreover, theories of political knowledge, in my view, if there is political knowledge, and I think there better be, if we have such a thing, if democracy makes any sense at all, there better be such a thing as political knowledge. I'm willing to defend that if you want to talk about it. But if there's political knowledge, and we're using knowledge in an ordinary sense, then there's got to be political truth. What this model tells us is that it's going to be difficult to find a single substantive property that makes our political judgments true. Because some judgments are about the empirical world, and some are about history, and some are about values. And they're all political judgments. Now, that could encourage some to be deflationists. Happily, there is a better answer, truth pluralism. But that is a story for another day. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have plenty of time for comments and discussion. I think the way we have been doing it in the other talks is to raise your hands, and I can check in the list of participants the order in which people are asking to participate. So. Moises?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, for your talk. I wanted to raise a worry that I don't know if it's too obvious. The worry is that maybe your account doesn't provide necessary conditions for a judgment to be political. And the obvious counterexamples would be these cases where there is no political disagreement, because your theory requires this, right? Requires that there is a political disagreement and that we make judgments that have to do with taking a position or contributing to that disagreement in some way. But I think it's easy to imagine possible cases and even plausible cases of societies where there is no disagreement about some kind of thing. For instance, I don't know, let's imagine that we live under the rule of a chief and we are a small community, traditional community. Everyone agrees that we must do what the chief says. And once a year we gather in a ceremony in which we all say, yes, we have to do what the chief says. So this seems to be a political judgment. It seems to reproduce the way in which we coordinate. It affirms the structures of authority and so on and so on. So it does seem to be a judgment that has an effect on our political life. It does seem to be a political judgment, but doesn't contribute in any way to a disagreement. And I think the examples can mount and mount. I don't know, for instance, I may be guessing here, but I think if the Spanish parliament took a vote on death penalty, everyone would be against it, and that would be an absolute consensus. Again, I may be guessing, but just imagine that is the case. In that case, that is still a political judgment, right? Even if there is no debate or controversy about it. And one more counterexample, and I leave it there. What about judgments that again seem to be clearly political, like this is a leftist proposal or this is a rightist thought, that don't convey disagreement? Think about, I don't know, something that everyone could agree in, like the strive for universal equality or something like that, or socioeconomic equality is a historical demand of leftist positions. You could say this in a public space, and that would be political. It could be something, I don't know, it could have some political effects, but everyone could agree with this kind of idea. So
yeah, fantastic set of questions, and you're absolutely right. And I was hoping that somebody would bring this up right away, because this clearly is, these sort of examples are clearly going to have to be one of the things that the account needs to deal with. And when preparing for this talk, one of the things that I considered doing was running through examples like this. So thank you very much for bringing them up. I think there's two different ways to respond to these kinds of examples. There's really three different ways. And I guess I haven't decided which way I want to go yet, because this is a new project for me. In fact, this is the very first time I'm giving this talk. Nobody's heard these thoughts other than you guys. So for me, I'm still at this tender moment, right, where I've got different moves that I can make on the chessboard. You know how it is, and I'm trying to figure out which way to go. So let me share all three of them with you, and you tell me which is the right way. Okay, so the first thing to do, and not all of them are applicable to each case. The first thing to point out is that there can be politics, that is, solutions to problems of coordination and conflict, even when some of the judgments we might make about those solutions are not functioning politically. And this is what I mean by and in fact, some of your examples are really perfect for that. So, for example, your case of the society that is ruled by a chief has been ruled by, let's say, something like a monarchy in a peaceful way for let's say generations. It may be that this, I think, often happens, particularly when there's religion involved, that it turns out that people accept the sort of certain what we would call background political assumptions. They accept them without question. There is no debate in the society about whether they're true. It's in fact not even raised. It's not even discussed. It's not even thought about. And if it were to be thought about, it would be seen weird, sacrilegious, against the crown. Now that's consistent with the case that there are political arrangements in that society, right? And when we, looking at the society, make political judgments about those arrangements, we could be making political judgments. So we have to distinguish between a couple different things. First, who's making the judgment? Are they inside the society or outside the society? That will determine, that context will determine whether the judgment could be political. And secondly, we need to make the distinction between whether a judgment is political and the certain facts about a political system. My account is not meant to be an account of what politics is. I'm in fact just assuming a certain account, a wide, well-known one, about what politics is. So that's the first set of distinctions, and that I think handles some of the cases that you gave, but not all the cases, as I'm sure you've already figured out. So the other thing that you might need to say is, I think you need to consider a modalization of the account, right? So this is sort of, for a philosopher, right? This is the most obvious move, right? I'm sure you saw this one coming, which is I could say, well, whether judgment J is a political judgment in context C is, at least partly determined by whether it can contribute to a political judgment. And then you can say, well, the important bit is could it be seen as contributing? Is it the sort of thing that could contribute to political judgment in some situation? So you could actually say that a judgment is a political judgment in a given context C, even if there's no actual disagreement over that judgment, because it could be part of there is such a thing as disagreement over that topic. So even though everybody agrees now on this account, that has no bearing on whether they might disagree in the future, or whether they did disagree in the past, or whether there's a possible world in which they disagree. So, and you could, a lot of the trick there would be figuring out what the accessibility relationship is between the possible worlds in which the disagreements occur in the actual world. So there's technical issues to work out there. So that's the second thing. The third thing, the way you could go is actually just the thing you suggested at the end. Notice I gave a sufficient condition. And the sufficient condition is enough for you to raise these problems. I didn't give necessary conditions. And one question would be whether really the work is being done, the work that I'm doing right now in answering your question might have to be done in the necessary conditions. And it may be that that's really what I have to do, is that I have to give a fuller account in order to make it plausible in light of these thoughts. So that's what I have to say. I have a bunch more things to say because I've been thinking about this a lot. I hope that was helpful. I don't take that to be a definitive answer to your question, but as an attempt to try to articulate how somebody who's advocating such a position would respond to it if they had been thinking a lot about it, which is what I have. So I hope that was helpful.
Thank you.
Okay. John?
Hi, Michael. Thanks for your talk. I was wondering about your statement, if there's no political disagreement, then there's no politics. I can imagine a society in which, there's seemingly political government, but there's scarce resources. So they've got to distribute these scarce resources in some kind of manner. But there's no disagreement and everyone kind of gets along and everyone is of the same mindset. I mean, wouldn't you say that's still politics in that certain case? So, Hume said something like, if there's unlimited goods, there is no need for justice, something like that. So just kind of bouncing off that idea, it seems like if there are scarce resources and they need to be distributed and you have some kind of centralized body that's, getting together to make the decisions of how goods are to be distributed, then you actually do have politics. You do have, political government.
Yeah, that's a great question. It feeds off the second one, the first one rather. And to that, I just want to say, and you probably have seen this in my responses to the first question. I would say, I think in that part of the talk, when I said without disagreement, there's no politics, I was speaking very loosely. I was trying to make a point with a rhetorical flourish, and one that I think is probably not, strictly speaking, true. both because of the point that I made about modalization, about the fact that it's really about what is potentially a disagreement, and also because of the distinction I was making between political judgments, that is, whether a judgment is political or functioning politically, which is the main topic of the talk, and whether there is a political system in operation. Political system, or whether there's even political activity, is determined by whether there are, as you pointed out, problems of coordination and conflict. Some of those problems might have been solved. And so a lot of the political activity about those problems has ceased to exist in a certain sense, right? There isn't lobbying, there aren't protests, there isn't arguments, there's just a bunch of background practices that are being employed in order to, that have solved that particular problem of coordination and conflict. So in that sense, there's diminished political activity, and perhaps in extreme cases, no political activity that we would consider political activity. But you're right to point out is that that still could function as a political system. I can grant all that, because really what I wanted to say was, my theory was about what makes a judgment of a particular kind a political judgment. And I was helping myself to an antecedent account of what political politics is about, an account that says what political activity happens to be involved in, and of course, what political systems or political authority is intended to do, that is, solve these sorts of problems. In that point that you were making, I think quite rightly, I'll just have to exercise that for the talk. I think that was probably just not wise of me to say that, rhetorical flourish or no. You know, what I was trying to get at is this sort of sense that when there are no, as were problems of conflict or coordination, then there are no politics. So what I was suggesting is we can, and that's consistent with the example that you gave. I mean, in other words, in a place in which resources are unlimited and no one has any problem with each other's differences, religious, sexual, ethnic, racial, or otherwise, when in fact it's heaven, as it were, then maybe there's no politics. That's at least something I'm open to entertain. But that claim that I'm making right now, is not something that I'm willing to defend in any sort of serious way. Because what I'm interested in is what makes a judgment political, not so much what politics is. I'm just helping myself to a sort of widespread view about what that is. Does that help? Great question.
Okay, Lillian didn't raise her hand, but she said in the chat that she wanted to ask a question around this time. So please, Lillian.
Okay, thank you. I didn't raise the hand because I didn't see where to do it. Sorry. Well, thank you very much for your talk, Michael. It was very interesting. And Javier and I have been working in a conception of political normativity, according to which politics is about responding to the question, what shall we do? And it's a matter of collective instrumental rationality.
Mm-hmm.
Or we are very sympathetic with your account. Only we also have a problem. Well, with two questions. One is a follow-up with first question, Moises' question about the need for disagreement, because you might say that there is some disagreement. If you are going to give an answer to the question, what shall we do? You might find disagreement on the question, what shall we do? But it doesn't mean that the conflict is inside. I mean that the question about what shall we do is in order to resolve a conflict. We might be peers that are very happy coordinating each other for years, and it's only that we are disagreeing on what to do, but not that we have a previous conflict that we have to solve. So I think that conflict can operate either in the object of the response to what shall we do, or in the procedure to respond to the question, what shall we do? And the other thing, so yeah, in that way, I would say I agree that that conflict can be everywhere, but as there is conflict in science or philosophy or wherever,
Mm-hmm.
on the responses that we give to the question. But I will agree with Moises that, or other people, that it's difficult to find any for any type of political debate, a debate on a conflict, not a debate that involves conflict, but a debate on a conflict, on a social conflict. I mean, okay. So, and the other question is, you said that not all political judgments are normative, but I think that as long as they are responses to the question, what shall we do? If they are not normative per se, they are normative. They are normative in the sense that they are premises to grant a normative stance. For example, climate change is real, therefore we should do this and that. So I think that what makes this empirical judgment a political judgment is that it has normative implications. So I would say that the nature of political judgment is normative. I mean, yeah. Well, what do you think? Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, that's great. That's a great set of questions and a really good set of questions. I'll try to track all that. As I understood you to make 3 different points, and see if I can keep them all in my head to make those responses. First response just just returns to the point that we've discussed, and I want to emphasize it perhaps more simply. I should have, maybe said this right from the get-go. First questioner noted this. I was really just giving you a sufficient condition. What I was saying is, if something's part of contributing political disagreement, then it's a political judgment. So there could be judgments that so, I did that to sort of get out of that problem about disagreement, right? So that's what I was confessing earlier, was that if I'd given it as a necessary and sufficient condition, then those counterexamples would really be problems. But I was pulling my punches in this talk precisely because of the reasons that I noted before, that I'm still trying to figure out whether I think it's a necessary and sufficient condition. I don't think so. It's a sufficient condition. Nonetheless, as you pointed out, you might say, well, wait a second. I can give you an easier account. I can say that these are essentially political judgments are about what we collectively should do. What should we do? Now, in the book that I'm writing, I have to confess that one of the things I say after this chapter is I say, well, I'm gonna summarize political judgments. My sort of bumper sticker for what a political judgment is, it's a judgment that is about, in a very wide sense of the term, about, a very wide sense, right? What we should collectively do. And like you, I mean, lots of political theorists believe that, right? So I think that's fine. Right. So you and I probably don't have that much to disagree with. I think we'd be like, yeah, okay, in a broad sense, that's right. And the question is really, now this gets to your third question, which is, well, how do you unpack that in a wide sense of about, right? And what you wanted to say, which I think was very smart, is you want to say, well, look, granted, not all the judgments have normative content, because they don't. But they could be premises in normative, well, I would say disagreements. You would say arguments, right? So again, we're very close, I think, right? I don't particularly have a problem with that, except, in fact, I flirted with that position myself. What I would try to say is, look, for somebody who's as close, whose position is as close as I'm interpreting you, as close to mine as yours is, then I guess what I'd suggest is what my model does is provide a little bit more detail about how a judgment can function in a political way. You want to say it functions in a political way, even if it's non-normative, when it's a premise in a particular inference. Fair enough. I agree that the truth of a political judgment, when a judgment is political, when it's contributing to a political judgment, disagreement, it's going to make an epistemic difference in most cases to the political disagreement, and that's a way of saying that it could play a role in inference, right? So fair enough. I also want to, though, point out that it can be the case that the judgment might not even make an epistemic difference at all, or much of one, because its truth or falsity could turn out, for reasons unbeknown to anyone in the disagreement, to have actually no bearing epistemically on the disagreement, even though everybody thinks that it does, because they have, let's say, a bad theory of of science, bad scientific theory that they're both assuming, but still function in politically in other ways. So I don't want to, by being expressive, by being action guiding, etc. Right. So what I want to say is my account provides a number of different criteria that allows for a slightly more, I would argue, I'm trying to sell you on it, right? A nuanced view of the of political judgments. But broadly speaking, I'm not in disagreeing with you. I mean, that's why I started where I started by saying, you know, broadly, you know, the initial answer is, look at what politics is. Politics has to do with what we should collectively do. That's what politics is. So broadly speaking, that's what politics is about. So what are broadly speaking political judgments about? That. But that's not a sufficient answer, I think, and I don't think you think either, to really say what's different between a judgment that's functioning politically and a judgment that's only functioning historically.
Just a minor remark.
Yes,
for us, it's important because we've been involved in politics, and we've been surprised by how damaging is the idea that politics is about conflict. Is the idea that if you don't have a conflict, you don't have a political position, or and well, this is a tradition that comes from Carl Schmitt. And
yes,
we think
I agree.
It's really damaging.
Okay. Yeah.
Follow-up.
No. I take this point very, very seriously. One of the things that I was worried about in giving the talk, as I was even setting up the PowerPoints for this talk, is I was worried about the fact, and in fact, it came out right away. I was worried that people would misinterpret me as saying that politics itself is that I'm basically embracing the Carl Schmitt and the agonist sort of approach. I'm not. And as I think if anybody's read my previous political views would be surprised to think that I would, right? So I'm not embracing that at all. I wasn't saying that politics is all about conflict even, but I was saying that political activity is very much motivated by the occasion of disagreement and problems of coordination and conflict. As you said, that's why I said coordination and conflict. We can have problems in our society even when we agree on basic principles. You know, we're trying to figure out how to utilize the well in the middle of town. It has the water. We all agree that everybody in town should get some of the water, and we all agree that people should get it in a fair and just way. The problem is, what does that mean? Does that mean that the farmer who needs more water because of the farmer's fields, should she get more water than me? I'm just the philosopher. I only need the water for myself. So those are political questions. Those are problems of political coordination. And I was using the term disagreement here to cover both problems of coordination and problems of conflict. I think what I'm learning from this super helpful discussion, by the way, this is incredible, these questions that you guys are asking me, it's super helpful. It shows me that I've got a problem in rhetoric here too, that I need to be careful to frame this in a way that doesn't get those Carl Schmitt alarm bells going off in people's heads, right? So point well taken. See, this is what's exciting about giving work that's brand new, is that I get to test this stuff out with smart people like yourself, and you could be like, well, but you're gonna have to return to the drawing board, something I knew I would have to do already. So anyway, super helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Michael Hannon.
Thanks so much. Hey, Michael, sorry I was late. I was running from a train station.
Hey, Michael.
I really enjoyed the talk. Thanks so much. This is super fascinating. I can't wait to see it develop. I was just going to pick up on one small thing. It's just a question of clarification, actually, rather than any kind of objection or anything like that. And it was about the stuff you were saying about identity reflective values. And I was thinking about two ways you could maybe understand the claim that these political judgments express or implicate identity reflective values. And I was wondering which one you wanted to go for. I sort of thought it would be the first one, but wanted to see how the second might fit in with your model. So the first one is something like, these are judgments that reflect sort of our firm convictions, right? And they're very important to who we are. And I think that's the kind of normal reading. So someone's beliefs about carbon emissions is rooted in their identity as an environmentalist or something like that. And that's really important to them. But then there's the other one that people like Jason Brennan and Elizabeth Anderson and Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels have been running, which is a lot of these political judgments. They're not really things that people actually care about. They're just saying some stuff because it kind of is a way of expressing commitment to a side, even though they don't have firm kind of commitments to those particular issues. And I guess the reason I raise this is just because, yeah, it raises interesting questions about public political discourse and disagreement. And just sort of, I guess, maybe something like a difference in disagreement in belief versus disagreements in attitude or something like that, or kind of orientation. So anyways, I was just wondering if you had one of those two in mind more, or how they would both kind of fit into what you're thinking.
So what I was, there I was pulling upon work in Know-It-All Society, which about conviction, this work that I've been doing for the last number of years about what convictions are. And so I'm just importing that theory and the paper, the work, the book and the papers and all that stuff. And I was crudely summarizing it there and not very clearly either, I have to admit. Partly because I was so excited about the new stuff that I was like, yeah. Right. You know how I am. I get like that. I get excited. So what I'll say is this: just because you're asking me, clear, straightforward question, which of those two interpretations? I was for purposes of the talk invoking the stronger one. So what I was saying was that political judgments can sometimes, when they hit that particular mark, be expressive of these strong political convictions, identity reflecting values. That's not to say that they can't be expressive of other things, of attitudes that are weaker than convictions, right? A conviction is a type of attitude, what I call commitment. A commitment, on my view, is neither, it's not a belief, right? It's more like an acceptance. This is very much related to the work that you're in the paper that you sent me, the new paper that's coming out, the Rutledge Companion. So I think, strictly speaking, what I should probably say are two things to your argument. First, I'd say, remember that my advantage of my model is that judgments can be more or less political, right? Which is intuitive, right? People can make a judgment that is sort of political. Why? Because it hits some of the marks of political, but not all, right? It's not a paradigmatically political one. And one way not to be paradigmatically or strongly political, put it that way, is that it's not expressive of a strong political conviction, right? And this fits the sort of point in the literature that you're alluding to that I know well, which is that people often engage in political activity and indeed make political judgments, often for reasons that are associative and not reflective of any well worked out or articulated sense of identity, or any sense of what the facts are, even, right? So that seems fine. I think I could leave it as it is and just make that point. In addition, that this is a way of illustrating how things can be more or less political. That being said, I think probably what I need to do in this section is using your work and others. Elizabeth Anderson is a good example, is to illustrate that political judgments are expressive, but they're expressive of a wide range of things, not just convictions. I was pulling on convictions because I wanted to highlight that because I think it's important. But you're right that wouldn't be the only type of attitude, surely not, that a political judgment can be expressive of. Political judgment can be expressive of, well, I mean, look, human beings can express their emotions, their attitudes, their sentiments, their senses of pleasure and displeasure by using any item of language and no language at all. That's the way expression works. So good point. Does that help?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks so much. That's really helpful.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for sending me that work. I obviously have to study it more closely to find out where you and I disagree more. I think we do disagree on something about truth aptness, but minor issue like that. But and notice, I just want to add for you, Michael, that I did not notice. I said nothing about whether these judgments are expressive of beliefs. I said nothing at all.
True, true.
Okay.
Okay, Carlin.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting. My question is also one of clarification, I think. So I was wondering how significant motive or intent is in the person that makes the judgment. So, for example, in the example of Elizabeth, who says that climate change is real, of course, the claim itself is not necessarily normative in that sense, but she does bring it up in order to make a political point, right? But what if I am, I mean, this is hard to imagine, but say I am a scientist who's just very interested in how temperature can get influenced by human behavior or whatever, and I just don't care about the political implications. Again, this is very hard to imagine, but I couldn't think of a better example. But say that I am stating a claim about, I don't know, it could also be about the effectiveness of face masks, and I'm just very interested in how those particles work, and I am not really making a claim about what the political implications of that should be. Is it then still a political statement or a political judgment, or is it just a judgment that happens to be politically relevant? Because it does make an epistemic difference, right, in the political debate, but I am not necessarily stating that claim in order to make this epistemic difference. So I was just wondering to what extent that intent matters, or if it matters at all for your
Yeah, so
idea.
it doesn't matter. It matters to some extent, your intention, but it certainly can be the case that your political you can make a political judgment on my account, even if you don't intend to. Actually, the Elizabeth example I meant to give, and I sort of botched the example when I was giving it. I'd overcomplicated it on my slide, and I apologize that. So let me just, I was actually trying to make the sort of case that you were making now. What I was imagining was, this is actually, I witnessed such an event where a scientist said, look, climate change is real and it's being caused by humans, and then said something about what she just said. She said, and that's not a political claim. And what I was imagining, let's imagine, as you were, that that second claim was an honest statement of her intentions. She was not intending to make it as a political claim. She is in fact saying, look, this is a statement of fact. It's not a political claim. And what I want to say, presumably you want to say too, is that, well, that's not a statement of political value. That's for sure. But it's not a normative claim. But it could still function in a variety of ways as a political judgment. And her second claim could do that as well. Her claim that it's not political could also be a political judgment, no matter what her intentions. The intentions do matter for one of the marks, the mark of whether the claim is evaluative or not. Because as I understood that, I said, and a mark is a judgment is a evaluative judgment when it expresses a pro or con attitude. And it seems difficult to imagine somebody unintentionally well, that's not true. Never mind. So I guess what I was going to say was, I was saying that it's difficult to imagine somebody unintentionally expressing a con or pro attitude, but that's not hard to imagine at all. People do express attitudes unintentionally. That's how, I mean, that's how I think about relationships between people. You know, take your partner or friend, spouse, whatever, all the time, people can unintentionally express con attitudes. Oops, shouldn't have said that. So yeah, I think actually my account is pretty intention free. I don't want to say intentions never matter, because of course they do matter to communication, and you don't have to be a Gricean to go that far, right? Of course, intentions matter to understanding each other, understanding what people are saying. But when we're trying to, as philosophers, classify a judgment as political or not, I'm claiming that it's the actual function in context, what it's doing in context outside of the person's head, as it were, that matters the most. Is that helpful?
It is. I guess my only concern would then be that, are you then not just including all empirical claims that might potentially be relevant, even, I don't know, I'm just wondering if that won't open up too many, so
Well,
for example, all the facts that have to do with
right.
climate
So what's
change
not
eventually
political,
become
right?
political judgments.
Right. Well, that's that's good. I don't want to say that every judgment that is made is always functioning as a political judgment, which is why I was hesitant to go the modal route that I mentioned I could go in answer to the first question, and why I only gave us a sufficient condition. I said if something's contributing to a political disagreement, it's a political judgment. So if it is contributing, then it's political judgment. That's all I said. I didn't say that, right, that it had to be contributing to a political disagreement. Even though some of my remarks, as I've admitted earlier, my rhetorical marks suggested otherwise. So what I do want to say is I want to heartily embrace Thomas Mann's maxim that almost anything can become political, including, as I gave with the Orwell example, even mathematical claims can become political. And moreover, things can cease to be political as well. Judgments can recede into the background of social life to a point at which they are no longer political. Maybe they should be political. I mean, one of the great things of second wave feminism, feminist theory, including feminist epistemology, including the feminist epistemology that's going right now, what's so important about that work is that work has forced people, men like myself, to understand that a lot of claims that were not functioning, we were not realizing, were assumptions that had been made that were contributing to political ends. Even though they weren't functioning politically, they should be understood as political claims about whose voices count, what positions are recognized, what's counted as philosophy, all those sorts of things. So so I do want to embrace the radical thought that I began with, which was that almost any proposition can come to account as the content of a political judgment. And sometimes some things that are not counting as contents of political judgments really should. And other times, things that are counting as political judgments maybe shouldn't be. But the fact is that social life is complicated enough to make it go to and fro in that way. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you.
Super great question.
Okay, Neftali.
Thanks for that talk. It's actually a follow-up from the previous question. Well, I realized that one part of the question that I wanted to pose was a follow-up from the previous question. It's about this idea that a judgment can be political even if you don't intend it to be political.
Yeah.
I completely agree with that. And I wanted to suggest that this idea might receive some support from the kind of empirical study that we are running, where we take a sentence that can be interpreted both descriptively and evaluatively, and we check the contextual factors that can determine whether that sentence in a particular context is interpreted descriptively or evaluatively, and therefore can be offensive. So we check intention, but also reaction of the audience and status of the speaker, higher status, but also in-group, out-group. And what the results that we have show is that intention is only one of the factors. It's not even the most relevant factor. Fun fact about it is that when we ask people to assess what's determined their evaluation, they insist on intention, and some of them on damage, not many people on status, right? So,
Right.
So that
Fair enough.
could support that kind of claim that you have there. The question that I had really had to do with, it's a clarification question on which, how far would you like to go with the semantic neutrality of political judgments? I mean, are you committed to the fact that you're not going to have a semantic accommodation for this action guiding mark of the political judgment? Yeah, completely agree that whether or not a single sentence acts as a political judgment or not, that's context dependent, but that doesn't exclude certain semantics. So I just wanted to know whether the kind of semantics that uses the distinction between locational and orientational information would do for you, or you want to be semantically neutral also with respect to these kind of accounts, and you just wanted to take like the implicative route or something like that. So it's just
yeah. So that's a really good question. I mean, one thing that I want to point out right from the get-go is that okay. So in general, in my thinking about semantics, I do often have to, although I try, as some of you know, try rather hard in some of my work on truth, not to get too dragged into certain technical semantic views, to commit my theory of truth to a particular set of semantic assumptions. Nonetheless, I can't really avoid that. And so, and partly that's due to the fact that in other work that I've done on semantics, I tend to take content first. I look at the concepts that I look at the concepts that compose propositions, and I understand the proper object of semantics to be propositions, not utterances or sentences. That's a disagreement right there with lots of other people. So that being said, what I am trying to do, I hope I'm being responsive to your question, what I am trying to do here is saying, well, actually, it's not the content. It's not the semantic content that's the sole determiner of whether a political judgment is a political judgment. It's actually the content plus, most importantly, what we're doing with the content. That is, how the content is regarded in or could be regarded in context, in this context of debates over coordination and conflict, that is, disagreements. So I guess in that respect, I'm trying to be semantically neutral, but there is a way in which you could say I'm not really being, because you might think, insofar as I think that context might impact how we understand the content of the judgments in question, as well as impacting what category the judgment may fall under, then I would have to commit myself to some version of possibly a variety of contextualism about the content of political judgments. But until that's proven to me, I said that's possible, I don't see that I have to. So maybe it's neutrality. Is that making sense?
Thanks a lot. Yeah, really helpful. Thanks a lot.
Okay. These are great questions. Thank you. I'm learning a lot. I don't know about you guys, but I'm learning something.
Sorry, we have a final question. I had not unmuted my computer. Michele, please.
Right, thanks. This is kind of a follow-up on the last question. I want to pick it up from what you said in reply to a previous question about the distinction between normative judgments and political judgments. Someone was saying, well, but to me it seems that even political discourse is normative in an important sense. And you replied to this observation by saying, yeah, I agree. And I was kind of thinking that you can't agree unless you make some commitments. You take up some commitments about the semantics, about the contents of these judgments. And here's an example. If we take a broadly expressivist line, which I felt like you were going for that for some of the things that you were saying, but now you kind of, in replying to Neftali, you said, no, perhaps I might want to go contextualist about this. So if you take a broadly expressivist view of normative discourse, right? So that view basically says that it is because of the function that normative thought and talk have, that the content of normative judgments can't be fully propositional, but it's got to be something like, you know, propositional and something else, according to the most sophisticated views, right?
Yes.
Possible words and plans.
Yep.
So in that case, so you have normativity. So the judgment is normative, and the content is also normative. So on this view, you can have a positive answer to the question. The political is normative, but you also have the results that all political judgments are normative, which is something that you didn't want to have. Right. So surely you have to rule out this fairly flat-footed way of looking at how expressivists would account for the normativity. I mean, not necessarily of politics, but, you know, of morality or any kind of domain that we would like to call normative in an important sense. And politics surely is normative in an important sense, if we agree with the observation that it is. So expressivist can't be the right way, but at the same time, a lot of things that you were saying and were very plausible to my ear looked like expressivists. So I don't know. This is just
that's a fantastic observation, and it is. You're very right about that. I have a long and complicated relationship, let's say, to expressivism. That is to say that I've never found expressivism flat out, even in its most sophisticated forms, of which there are many, to be completely convincing as an analysis of a lot of a complete analysis of our normative thought and talk. However, and the reason I've been very troubled by that is because I think that it is important theoretically and politically to be able to articulate how and in what way normative talk and thought can be true or false. That's been a sort of important feature of my work. So what I've tried to say is, what I've tried to do in work in the past is try to explain how expressivists really shouldn't be deflationists, and that's a different debate, right, about deflationism, but I have problems with that too. So, but rather should embrace a different type of view of truth, different semantics as far as truth is concerned, and that is a sort of pluralism about truth. And, you know, one of the things I've had in my debates with Simon Blackburn over the years is that, you know, Simon thought this himself back in the day, back in spreading the word, and beforehand, he himself thought that, well, what expressivists needed to do, as he put it then, is build a different theory of truth for expressivist claims. And then later, Paul Horwich came along, and everybody thought, you know, just because of Horwich, but Simon was persuaded by Horwich that we should just be deflationists. Part of what I'm working towards in this book, in this theory of political truth, is a theory of political judgment that incorporates the lessons that we learn from expressivism, that sees that actually trying to understand our political judgments is only going to be successful if we understand them in terms of their function, including their expressive function, but has a technical theory of truth that allows you to also understand how they can be true or false, and that's important, or false is in a substantive way. Because one of the things I think we really need to understand in political theory is how we get things wrong in political theory. Bertrand Russell once said that you can always tell how good a political theory, a theory of truth is by looking at its theory of falsehood. And I think that's true in politics as well. So yeah, I'm not going full expressivist here, but I am relying on a lot of the things I said were self-consciously expressivist in nature, in sound. So And then in response to your point, and then I'll leave it at this. Yeah, it's a big part, a central lesson of what I'm trying to do. If you guys, people leave this talk thinking about anything at all, one of the things I would ask you to think about is the way in which Mon's maxim seems right to me, that almost anything can be political. And as a result, it's really important for political theory to understand the role that non-normative judgments make in expressing our political convictions, among other things. That in order to explain that, you might not need my theory, but you're going to need a theory. And that's what I'm suggesting here today.
Well, okay, I want to thank everyone for attending and people for their excellent questions. And of course, Michael, for your very illuminating talk and for sharing with us for the first time this plan for your future book. I think we have learned a lot, and we hope that you have found interesting feedback here.
I certainly have. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. And if you have further questions, please email me. I'm working on this stuff right now. So, this is the moment. If you see me steering towards rocks, my ship is about to founder on rocks. Now is the time to leap up and say, no, turn. All right, before we all crash. Okay, so email me if you have questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.